Alright guys, this is Steven Tucker. I just wanted to do another session on how we grind the bed knives for the QA5. We're using the SIP grinder, and we're using the V block pallet, and this is kind of the new pallet that Mark at SIP came up with. I really like it because it actually grinds the bed knife from the pivot bolt versus setting it down on something. There's a couple grinder manufacturers that do it this way, and I think that's the best way to do it, and I'll explain to you why once we get done grinding. What you see Wallace, my assistant, doing is we've got a roller shaft that we check the run out on, and is pretty perfect all the way down from one end to the other. What we're doing is we're taking the roller shaft and we're inserting it where typically the bed knife pivot bolts would be, and really just trying to calibrate the grinder first. And it's really just to show how accurate it is for the most part. So what he's doing is take a dial indicator gauge, and we're going to run it down the length on the top of the roller shaft. We're going to run it down the length of that shaft and see how much it moves as we move it back and forth. And you know, it's within a thousandth. I mean, that's pretty good. We're going to do the same thing on the front. So we go down the front end of this shaft, and you see he's got it right around 24, and it's pretty stable across the front. It just looks like it's staying right there. So the reason that we're doing that is we want to make sure that the top and the front of that bed knife are perfectly straight when we go to put it in there. We want the grinder to grind as accurately as possible. And the one thing about the SIP grinder, you'll notice that it's got two grinding stones, one for the top and one for the front, and it grinds both the top face and front face at the same time. But the stones themselves don't move back and forth on shafts. It's the bed knife. The stones don't move, period. So as the bed knife's going to move back and forth, we want to make sure that everything's perfectly flat. Now, he's got the bed knife mounted in there. Currently we're using bolts, because if you use the actual bolts that come with the bed knife, it won't fit in those brackets. So we actually just made some bolts, and it's flats that it's sitting on, and I'm going to improve on that later. What he's trying to do is set the angle to 0. We want the bed knife to be perfectly flat when he gets it set, and he's got a little bolt that you see him turning underneath that will push the bottom of that bed knife up in those pivot bolts, and he'll be able to get the angle set at 0. Once he gets the angle set at 0, then we know from that point we can change our grinding the motor head to the right angles. I believe we're grinding these bed knives right at 10 degrees on the top and on the front. It being the QA5. I believe they're called for like 5 and 5 in the book. I like to be a little bit more aggressive, just because of our turf situations, and we've seen the best results from that. So he's got it set at 0, and he'll just lock that in place, and then now we know that the bed knife's setting perfectly straight. Now, one of the things and the reasons that I like this, and I'll show you in a picture later, is it's how we're grinding the bed knife how it actually sits in the machine. If you watched my previous video on the leveling table, you notice that I like to do everything as it sets in the turf. So anytime I can duplicate that in the shop, I think it certainly helps. What he's doing here is just putting layout fluid across the bed knife so we can see what the grinding pattern looks like. I don't do this on every single one. I do it on the first one of the set, just so that I can make sure that everything looks good and we're grinding where we need to be grinding. It's called Steel Blue. If you want to use it, I think we get it from MSC Industrial. We buy quite a bit of it at a time, and like I said, we just do that on the first set to make sure all our angles are correct. Here he's scratching across the top face just to kind of see where we're at. as far as contact on the knife. So now we're going to run it back and forth and just make sure that the contact is light as we're going across there, so when we turn the stone on, it doesn't gouge a bed knife at all. But also, it's really for us to be able to judge how smooth this bed knife is going to be. As I was saying earlier, and grinding this bed knife from the pivot bolt as it would sit in the machine, we're assuming that, on some grinders, I guess the best way to explain this is on some grinders you can move the end of the knife closer to the stone and your methodology would have been to square the bed knife to the stone. What we're doing here with the shaft earlier was we wanted to check and make sure that it was going to travel straight on the top face and on the front face all the way across. So once we determined it's going to travel straight, there's no reason for us to have to level the front edge of the knife or the top edge of the knife to the stone. It should be perfectly flat once we mount it in the bed bar. Well, I think we all know it's never that way. So what we're doing is we're trying to duplicate the results of every bed knife. And if your measurements are determined based on you mounting the knife on the bed bar and then squaring it up on the grinder, well then, you're assuming that the bed knife manufacturer has made it proper, and that doesn't all the time happen. First off, they don't put your bed bar on, or your bed knife on your bed bar. So if the screw holes are slightly offset, you won't know. You're just basing it off of that. This is kind of the way it looks on the finish. Two things we're looking at: one, smoothness, consistency, and two, thickness. We want to make sure that the thickness on the front edge of the knife is consistent all the way across. Finally, this is the different types of rear rollers that we use on the QA5. During the aggressive summer months, we'll use the Wiley roller that you see there on the back, and then when we're in season and during the Byron Nelson tournament, we are using the solid roller. Now the diagram is that I have here. It basically shows, if you look at the yellow line, all right, so from the pivot bolt, which is the bolt that where it starts, to the front edge of the knife, that is the area in which the grinder is going to grind the bed knife. All right, so if I don't grind from the pivot bolt, then I don't know that the distance from the pivot bolt to the front edge of the knife is exactly the same on both sides. If I just push the knife up to the grinding stone on both sides, how do I know that the distance from the pivot bolt to the front edge of the knife is the same? And so that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that, if you're going to grind the bed knife and the importance of where the front edge kind of meets the reel or the center line of the reel, is that important? Well, then how can we grind it by moving one end of the knife closer to make sure that it's touching off on both sides like most grinders do? And I'll be the first to tell you that I don't support any companies or how they do things, but in my mind, if you're looking at the proper way to grind a bed knife, obviously I feel that the pivot bolt's the right way to do it, and then not moving the bed knife forward or back or up and down to make sure it's touching off on both ends, but actually to have the bed knife flat in the grinder, and then for you to grind that bed knife perfectly flat on the top and front face, because I believe that is going to give you the exact same results from one bed knife to another. Because like I said before, if you're touching off, from one bed knife to the next, it could be a little bit different. Like your screw holes not being perfectly straight, maybe the pivot bolt was a little bit different, when it goes in those, and we hope that they're all exactly the same. But I think when we mount the bed knives on there and we grind, we know they're not going to grind exactly the same every time. So we already know that the bed knives don't mount perfectly flat every single time we mount them. So why would the pivot bolts, how could we guarantee the pivot bolt's in the exact right spot, or that the screw holes are in a straight parallel line with the front edge of the bed knife. We don't know that. So the only way to properly do it would be to grind the front edge as we've done it here. So anyway, I just wanted to put this together for you guys, and you know, feel free to leave any comments or your suggestions or thoughts. We're going to have some new prototype tools that help us do that alignment process a little bit better. Hopefully that I can do a video on here soon. So thanks for watching, and I hope this helps.